When he opened the trunk, he didn't see a prize. He saw someone who needed to rest. The trunk was the last thing I planned to open that day. I'd come back to the claim at sundown with my mule, Cobb, moving slow the way he always did after a long pull through the canyon. Dust on everything. Dust in the creases of my hands, behind my ears, in the corners of my eyes where it had no business being. I'd been out since before light, checking the western bend of the creek where I'd seen color 3 weeks running, and I had maybe a quarter-ounce of fine dust wrapped in a cloth square in my coat pocket, and nothing else to show for 11 hours of cold water up to my knees. 52 years old. 20 years working claims in Texas, Colorado, and now out here in the Nevada hills where the rock was harder and the winters came early, and the other prospectors had mostly given up and gone home to whatever they'd run from in the first place. I hadn't gone home. I didn't have one. My camp wasn't much. A dugout shelter cut into the hillside, roofed with pine poles and canvas, a stone ring for the fire, a folding table I'd carried from Abilene tied across Cobb's back. I had a good Dutch oven, a wool blanket that had seen better years, and a crate of supplies I restocked every 2 months in a place called Red Horse Crossing, which wasn't much of a town but had a dry goods store and a man named Pettifer who didn't ask too many questions. The canyon itself was the kind of place that stopped being beautiful once you'd been in it long enough. 3 years in, I didn't look at the canyon walls anymore. I looked at the creek and what was in it. That's what working a claim does to a man, strips the decoration off everything and leaves you with the practical. I knew every rock on my stretch of that creek, the way a carpenter knows his tools. I could tell you which bend silted heavy and which ran clean, which overhanging bank gave good color, and which was fool's errand, where the beaver had been before they gave up and moved on, where the deer came down to drink if you were quiet enough in the early morning. I knew the claim. I didn't know much else anymore. I led Cobb to his picket line and started unsaddling him, and that's when I saw the trunk. It was sitting at the edge of my camp, maybe 30 feet from the shelter entrance, pushed up against the base of the juniper that marked the north corner of my claim. Large trunk, brown leather over wood, with brass fittings gone green. Somebody had dragged it there. I could see the groove in the dirt where it had been hauled, coming from the south trail, the one that came up from the canyon floor. I stood and looked at it for a while. I wasn't the kind of man who panicked at strange things. I'd been alone long enough that my first response to anything unexpected was to stand still and think it through rather than go running in or running away. The trunk hadn't been there when I left at 4 in the morning. That meant somebody had come up the south trail during the day, brought the trunk, and either left it here deliberately or abandoned it in a hurry. Neither option made me want to walk up and open it. I finished unsaddling Cobb, put out his grain in the nose bag, started a fire in the stone ring and got the coffee pot on, watched the trunk from across the fire. It didn't move. There were men in those hills who'd hide things in another man's camp to come back for. There were other men who'd use a strange item to draw a man's attention while someone came up from behind. I'd heard of both. I'd been in these canyons long enough to take those things seriously. I let the coffee get done, and I sat on my log stump, and I watched that trunk in the firelight, and I drank half a cup and I thought. No one had any reason to drop something at my specific claim. I wasn't rich. Anyone watching me work knew that. I wasn't connected to anyone, didn't owe anyone, didn't have enemies that I was aware of, which is a thing you can say with fair confidence once you've been alone long enough. The other men who worked claims in the canyon were 2 miles north and 1 mile south, and I knew them by sight, and none of them were the kind to leave property in another man's camp. The groove in the dirt was from something being dragged a long way, by someone who didn't have help. After maybe 20 minutes, when the coffee was ready and I'd eaten half a hard biscuit left over from morning, I took my rifle from the saddle scabbard and walked over. Up close I could see the trunk had been dragged a long way. The leather was scraped on the bottom, not just along the visible groove but across most of the underside, which meant the last few yards weren't the only rough ground it had come across. The brass latch on the front was bent like somebody had tried to force it once, or like it had been dropped hard on a rock. There was a leather strap handle on either end, both of them worn down to near nothing. The handles were the kind that went bad fast when weight was applied wrong, which told me whoever had dragged this had done it from the bottom or the side, not the handles, because the handles weren't up to the weight. Whoever had dragged this had figured that out partway through. I should tell you that I had, in those 20 years, opened other men's trunks without their permission, and with no good outcome either time, so I had some personal history with the decision. But both of those times I was younger and had reasons that seemed compelling at the time, and that I am not proud of now. This time I was 52 and tired, and I told myself I was only going to look, and I set the rifle against the juniper trunk within easy reach and crouched down and undid the brass latch. The lid came up, and there she was, curled up inside with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, wearing a dark blue dress that had been good once, maybe 2 years ago, and a wool shawl so thin it had gone to lace in 2 places. Her hair was dark brown and loose, some of it stuck to her cheek. She was breathing. I could see that right away, the shallow rise and fall of her ribs, but she was not conscious. Her lips were cracked. The skin around her eyes looked like she'd been crying long enough that the red had set in permanent. She was maybe 30 years old, maybe less. Hard to tell when someone is that worn down. I crouched there for a moment and looked at her. I was not a man who cried, not for a long time. But I'll say that something moved in my chest looking at her, not the thing you might be thinking of, not that. Something else. Something that said, somebody did this to a person. Somebody reduced a person to this, curled up in a trunk, hiding on a stranger's claim in the middle of nowhere at the end of the world. I reached in and put my hand on her shoulder, gentle as I could. "Ma'am," I said. "Nothing." I said it again, a little louder. Her eyes came open slowly. They were gray, her eyes, gray like creek water in winter. She looked at me and I could see her trying to place where she was, and then I could see the moment she realized she didn't know, and the fear came into her face like a cold wind coming under a door. She tried to push back in the trunk deeper, which was not possible because she was already at the back of it. "Easy," I said. "You're on my claim. I found you just now. I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at me. The fear didn't leave her face, but she stopped trying to go backward. "You need water," I said. "Can you sit up?" She didn't answer. She watched me the way a doe watches you in a clearing, still, measuring, ready to bolt if the hand moves wrong. I stood up slowly, stepped back, and went to the camp, got my tin cup and the water jug and brought them back and set them on the ground a few feet from the trunk. Then I stepped back again. She sat up in the trunk slowly, one hand gripping the edge. I could see her arms trembling. She looked at the cup, then at me. "It's just water," I said. She looked at me another long moment. Then she reached out and took the cup. She drank the whole thing. Then she held the cup and looked at it. "There's more," I said. I filled it again from the jug. She drank half of that. Then she just held it in both hands, and I could see that she was holding on to it the way you hold on to something when you don't have anything else to hold. I didn't say anything for a while. The fire crackled. Cobb shifted on his picket line. The dark was coming down off the ridge and the stars were beginning to show over the eastern hills, and it was getting cold the way it got cold out there, fast and with meaning. "Can you stand up?" I asked. She looked at me. "It's going to get cold," I said. "You need to get out of that trunk and come by the fire." She looked at the fire. Then she looked at me again, and I could see she was trying to decide something big, something that had a lot of weight to it. "I won't bother you," I said. "I'm just a man trying to work a claim. You're welcome to the fire." She climbed out of the trunk stiffly, gripping the edge, and I could tell from the way she moved that her body hurt her in several places that weren't about being folded up in a trunk. She stood up and wrapped the thin shawl around herself and looked around at my camp, the dugout, the fire, the folding table, Cobb on his line, and then she looked at me. She had a look that had something in it I recognized without being able to name it right away. Not just fear. Something alongside fear. Like fear had been her companion for so long that she'd stopped being surprised by it, and underneath the fear was something else, something tired. Not tired the way you're tired after a long day, tired all the way down. "Come by the fire," I said. She came. Her name was Iris Calloway, and she didn't tell me that for 3 days. For the first 3 days she didn't tell me anything. She sat by the fire when I had it going, which was most of the time once I understood she needed the warmth. She slept in my dugout on the bedroll I set up for her, and I slept outside rolled in the wool blanket, which was cold but manageable, and I didn't complain about it and she didn't acknowledge it. She ate what I cooked, not much the first day, more the second, close to a full portion the third. She didn't ask questions and I didn't ask them either. What I noticed. She listened hard, the way she'd go still when a horse's hooves sounded in the distance, or when voices carried up from the canyon floor. The kind of listening that comes from needing to know what's coming before it gets there. I knew that kind of listening. I'd done it myself at different points in my life, for different reasons. She kept the trunk closed. First day she dragged it herself to the entrance of the dugout, which was a project given how heavy it was, and I didn't offer to help because I could see she needed to do it herself. Second and third day it stayed there at the entrance. I didn't know what was in it, and I didn't ask. She could work. That surprised me on the second morning. I came back from the creek at midday and she'd restacked my wood, which I'd been piling sloppy, and she'd organized the tin goods on my folding table by size, and she'd found my broom, a short thing made of bound juniper twigs, and swept out the dugout. Not out of obligation. I could tell because she wasn't watching for my reaction when I came back. She was just doing it because it was there to be done. I cooked that night, the same as the others, salt pork and beans and the last of the cornbread, and she ate, and we sat on opposite sides of the fire, and the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. Or it wasn't uncomfortable to me. I had spent most of my life in silence. It was my natural state. I want to be clear about what those first 3 days were, because I think a man my age looks back on a thing like this and is tempted to make it sound like he knew what he was doing. I didn't know what I was doing. I was a prospector. I worked a claim. I didn't know how to have a woman in my camp any more than I knew how to fly. What I knew was to be quiet and not demand things, which is not the same as knowing how to care for someone, but it was close enough for the beginning. On the fourth morning I was sharpening my pick at the stone, and she came and sat on the log beside the fire, close enough that I could see her clearly in the morning light, and she said, "My name is Iris Calloway." I looked up. "From Mineral Fork," she said. Then, like she was deciding whether to say more, and then deciding yes. "Before that, from Ohio." I nodded. "Tom Beale," I said. "From Abilene, before that from Kentucky." She nodded. She looked at the fire. "Who knows you're here?" she asked. "Nobody," I said. "Nobody ever knows where I am." Something in her face shifted slightly when I said that. Not quite relief. Something more like the first breath after holding it a long time. I went back to sharpening the pick. After a while she said, "How long have you been working this claim?" 3 years, I said, going on 4. "Is it good?" "It's enough," I said, "been enough so far." She looked out toward the canyon. The morning light was coming in sideways now, catching the top of the canyon walls and turning the red rock orange. She looked at it like she was seeing it for the first time, which she was. "Mineral Fork is 2 days south of here," she said. "I know it," I said. "I've passed through." "I left," she said. I didn't say anything. "I left in a hurry," she said. "I couldn't take much. I took the trunk because I could put things in it and drag it. I didn't," she stopped. "I didn't know where I was going. I just had to go north, get away from the valley." I put the sharpening stone down and looked at her. She was looking at the canyon, her chin set. She had that tired thing underneath her face, but on top of it there was something else now, something angular and resolved that I hadn't seen before. Like she'd made the decision to talk, and having made it she was going to do it right. "My husband," she said. "He's not the man I thought he was when I married him. He's not. He stopped being that man a long time ago, if he ever was." She paused. "He has friends in Mineral Fork. The sheriff is one of them. I couldn't go through town. I had to go around up the canyon. It took me 2 days." I said, "Alone?" "Yes." I looked at her hands. In the morning light I could see what the dark had hidden, the yellowing bruise along her left forearm, the way she held her right shoulder a little higher than the left. "Did you sleep?" I asked. "A little in the trunk. I dragged it up into the rocks when I was too tired to go on, and I got inside and latched it from in here." She glanced at the trunk. It was cold. She said it plainly. No plea in it, no bid for sympathy. Just a fact she was reporting. I picked up the sharpening stone again. "You can stay here," I said, "as long as you need." She looked at me. She had that gray-eyed measuring look again. "I can earn my keep," she said. "You already have," I said. "My wood was a mess." Something moved in her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one, briefly. Then it was gone. "I'll need to get you more supplies," I said. "I go into Red Horse Crossing every 2 months. I'll go sooner." "You don't have to." "You need a coat," I said, "and boots. Those aren't going to hold up." She looked down at her shoes. They were women's shoes, the kind made for town, and they'd been through 2 days of canyon trail and they showed it. "I'll pay you back," she said. "You can pay me back in firewood," I said. "You're better at stacking it than I am." This time the thing in her face was closer to a smile, and it stayed a little longer. I went to Red Horse Crossing the next day. I told Pettifer at the dry goods store that I had a woman at my camp helping with the cooking, which was the simplest explanation, and he didn't look up from his ledger when I said it, which I appreciated. I bought what I needed, the coat, the boots, sizing based on what I'd seen of her, and I bought flour and dried fruit and coffee beans and a good block of salt. And I added a small hand mirror because I'd seen her look once at the tin cup when she was washing her face, and I'd understood what that was about. I thought a long time about the hand mirror standing in the store. I bought it. I put it in the pack with the other things without calling attention to it. She inspected the boots when I got back. She held one, turned it over, looked at the sole. "Good boots," she said. "Good cobbler in Red Horse," I said. She put the boots on. They were close to right. She laced them up without a word and stood up and walked the length of the camp and back, testing. "They'll do," she said. I nodded and went to unsaddle Cobb. She found the mirror that evening. She didn't say anything about it. In the morning I noticed it in the dugout on the small shelf I'd made from a board and 2 pegs, and it stayed there after that, and I never mentioned it and neither did she. The weeks settled into a shape. I rose before light and worked the claim through the cold morning hours when the water was clearest and the panning was best. I came up for midday and we ate whatever she'd put together from the stores, and I went back down in the afternoon and I came up at dusk. She had supper going. We ate. We sat by the fire. We went to our respective sleeping arrangements. On Sundays I didn't work the claim. I maintained equipment, tended Cobb, handled the work that accumulated during the week, mending, organizing, the small repairs a camp always needs. She had her own Sunday projects. She'd begun, without asking permission or announcing it, to improve the camp in steady ways. The wood restacking was the first thing. Then she figured out a way to cache the supplies so the mice couldn't get at them, using a tin box and a board suspended by wire. I'd lost half a sack of cornmeal to mice the winter before, and I'd been angry about it for months, and she solved it in an afternoon. She patched the canvas roof of the dugout at a seam that had been letting weather in, using pieces of canvas from a scrap I'd saved, and she did it better than I would have tighter stitches, better overlap. She organized the tools. I had a habit of setting things down wherever I happened to be when I was done with them, and over a period of about a week, I noticed the tools were always where they ought to be. She'd made a rack from 2 boards and some bent nails, and the tools hung on it in a row, and I could find what I needed without hunting. That sounds like a small thing. For a man who'd been alone for 11 years losing tools and finding them and losing them again, it was not a small thing. I brought back a dictionary from Red Horse Crossing without being asked. I'd seen her working through the newspaper and then through my history book with the careful focus of someone learning shapes, and I thought the dictionary would help. I set it on the folding table, and she looked at it and then looked at me and said, "Thank you," which was the most direct expression of anything she'd offered in the weeks she'd been there, and I could see it cost her something to say it plainly like that. "Don't mention it," I said, and went to see about Cobb. She worked through that dictionary. She'd look up words she'd found in the history book, and sometimes she'd ask me about one she couldn't find a clear explanation for, and we'd have a small conversation about what a word meant. Those were the best conversations we had in the early weeks, small, concrete, about a specific thing. She had a good mind, and talking about words was easier than talking about ourselves. She was funny. I said this before, but I want to give you an example. One evening, Cobb had gotten himself tangled in the picket line, which he managed to do once or twice a month through what appeared to be spite, and I'd spent 20 minutes sorting it out and come back to the fire in not the best mood, and she watched me sit down and pour my coffee and be irritable, and then she said, without looking up from the dictionary, "He doesn't do it on purpose." "He does," I said. "He's a mule," she said. "He doesn't have a plan." "Then why does it only happen on the days when I'm too tired to deal with it?" I said. She looked up from the dictionary. She looked at Cobb, who was standing peacefully on his line, all innocence. Then she looked back at the dictionary. "Maybe you get tired on a predictable schedule," she said. I sat there with that for a moment. "That's not helpful," I said. "Probably not," she agreed and turned a page. I found myself, 2 days later, thinking about that exchange and being in a better mood than I'd expected, for no clear reason. I want to be straight with you about what those first weeks were, because I don't want you to think it was easy or that I had some clear sense of what I was doing. It wasn't easy. I'd been alone for 11 years. My wife, Eleanor, died of fever in the winter of '68. We had a son, James, who was 3 when she died and who I couldn't care for on my own the way he deserved, and I did something that has been a stone in my chest every day since. I left him with Eleanor's sister in Kansas and told myself I'd come back when I had enough money to give us both a decent life, and I went west to find that money, and 11 years had passed and I still hadn't found it. And somewhere in those 11 years, I'd become a man who didn't know how to be around people anymore. Not hostile, I wasn't that, but I'd shed the habits of company the way a tree sheds bark, and what was underneath was something that worked fine alone and didn't know what to do when it wasn't. First week, the main thing I did wrong was talk too much about practical things and nothing about anything else, which is the thing a man who doesn't know how to talk does when he feels he should be saying something. I'd explain what I was doing on the claim, what tools I used and why, the geology of the canyon, the theory of where gold tended to collect in a stream bed. She'd listen. She'd ask a reasonable question sometimes, real curiosity in it, not politeness. But I could hear myself, late in the day, and I knew I was filling silence with information, because the other kind of talking was beyond me. I also didn't know how to accept being looked after. That was the other thing. She'd hand me coffee in the morning, and I'd take it and say nothing because I didn't know what the right thing to say was. Not thank you, I knew that, but some acknowledgement of her, of what she'd done. It took me 3 weeks to understand that what she wanted was not acknowledgement so much as simply to be let do it. She wasn't looking for gratitude. She was looking to be useful, and to be allowed to be useful without it being made into a transaction every time. I stopped saying thank you for every small thing. I started just accepting it. That was better for both of us. About 5 weeks after she arrived, a man came up the South Trail on a roan horse. I saw him from the creek, from the working area, while I was cleaning my pan. He came up slow, not furtive, but not announcing himself either, and he stopped at the edge of my camp and sat on the horse and looked around. Iris was at the dugout entrance. She saw him about the same time I did. I watched her go still. I put down the pan and walked up from the creek. The man was about 40, heavy through the chest, wearing a brown leather vest over a flannel shirt and a flat-brimmed hat with a crease in the crown. He had a rifle in a saddle scabbard and a pistol on his right hip, and the look of a man who carried both of those things as matter-of-fact tools rather than as displays. He looked at me as I came up from the creek. "Help you?" I said. "Looking for a woman," he said, "traveling alone, brown hair. Might be going by the name Cowboy." I stopped about 10 feet from his horse. "Don't know any Cowboy," I said. He looked past me toward the dugout, toward Iris standing at the entrance. He looked back at me. "That her?" he said. "That's my wife," I said. There was a silence. I'd said it without planning to say it. It had come out of me flat and certain, the way a true thing comes out, except it wasn't technically true. But the moment I said it, it felt like something that was going to be true, and the distinction between those two things didn't trouble me the way maybe it should have. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Iris again. She was standing there in the coat I'd bought her, her arms at her sides, not moving, looking back at him. "Your wife," he said. "That's right," I said. "How long you been married?" "Long enough," I said. He shifted in the saddle. He was deciding something. I could see it. "Man in Mineral Fork says his wife went north 3 weeks ago. Owes him a debt." "I don't know anything about debts in Mineral Fork," I said. "My wife has been on this claim with me all summer." He looked at Iris again. She looked back at him without moving. I watched his eyes read her face, looking for the thing that would tell him she was frightened, that she was under coercion, that the man standing behind him was holding something over her. He didn't find it. She looked back at him with her gray eyes, steady and clear, and gave him nothing to work with. He looked at me, then he said, "What's your name?" "Tom Beale," I said. "Registered claim, Lot 47, Canyon Section. You can check it in Red Horse Crossing." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said finally. "Sorry to bother." He turned the horse and went back down the South Trail. I stood and watched until he was out of sight around the first bend. Then I walked back to camp. Iris was still standing at the dugout entrance. She was looking at where the man had disappeared down the trail. Then she looked at me. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said. "He'll go back and tell him." "Yes," I said. "Then he'll come himself," she said, "or he'll send more men." "Probably," I said. She looked at me with those gray eyes and I could see her working through something, and then she said, "Why did you say it?" I thought about that. Not what the answer was, I knew what the answer was, but how to say it right. "Because it was the best answer," I said, "and because I stopped. Because I didn't want him to have an easy time of it, whatever he thinks he has a right to." She was quiet. The wind came down off the ridge and moved the fire ash. "He's going to make trouble," she said. "He's welcome to try," I said. She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "I'll start supper," and she went into the dugout, and I went back down to the creek and finished washing my pan, and the day went on the way days did on a claim. His name was Roy Calloway, and he was not a man who let things go. I'd expected him to come. I hadn't expected him to bring 4 men with him, one of whom wore the deputy badge of Mineral Fork, which meant the sheriff had sent a representative rather than making the ride himself. That told me something. It told me the sheriff wanted deniability but was in it. They came up the South Trail on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the man in the brown vest. I was working the claim. Iris was at the camp. I came up when I heard the horses, and I had my rifle and I came up the slope to camp at a walk, not a run. I didn't want to be breathing hard when they got there. Roy Calloway was not what I'd imagined. I'd imagined someone bigger, more overtly dangerous looking. He was a medium-built man with a dark beard trimmed close, maybe 45, good clothes for the frontier, a wool coat, good boots. He had the look of a man who'd been successful enough that he didn't have to prove it with his appearance, which sometimes makes a man more dangerous, not less, because he's used to getting what he wants through arrangements rather than force, and when arrangements stop working, he doesn't know what he's turned into yet. He stopped his horse at the camp edge and looked at Iris. She was standing near the fire, her hands at her sides. "Iris," he said. "Roy," she said. He looked at me. "You the man who told my man she was your wife." "That's right," I said. "She's not your wife," he said. "She's mine." "She left you," I said. "A woman who leaves is not a wife anymore, in my understanding." "Your understanding doesn't count for much out here," he said. "The law counts for something." He looked at the deputy. The deputy was a young man, maybe 25, and he didn't look entirely happy to be there. He had the expression of a man who'd been given an assignment and was already regretting it. "Mr. Beale," the deputy said, there's a legal matter here. Mrs. Calloway is legally." "Is she in danger here?" I said. "I know, sir, but—" "Has she committed a crime?" "Not as such, but—" "Then I don't see what the legal matter is," I said. Roy Calloway's face had gone flat. "She's my property," he said. "She owes me 6 years, and she's going to pay it." The words came out of him easy, like a man reading off a ledger entry. That easiness told me more about him than anything else he might have said. He believed it. Not performatively. He genuinely believed the accounting was real, and that the debt was owed, and that he was the one owed it. I said no. Just that one word. He looked at me. He was deciding how much effort this was worth. I could see him running through the arithmetic, one man with a rifle, 4 of them, a legal representative present, the claim registered, the distance from anything that mattered. He was a man who thought in terms of expense. This was becoming expensive. "I got 4 men with me," he said. "I see that," I said. "You got a rifle and you're one man." "That's right," I said. Something happened then that I didn't engineer and didn't expect. Iris walked across the camp to where I was standing, and she stood beside me. Not behind me, beside me. Her shoulder was about 6 inches from my arm. She didn't say anything. She just stood there. Roy Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Some of the flatness left his face and something else came in, something harder to read. Maybe he'd expected her to come when he called, the way things had probably worked between them for 6 years. Maybe he'd expected her to be smaller out here than she'd been there, more frightened, more alone. She wasn't. She was wearing the coat I'd bought and the boots that fit her, and her hair was clean and her chin was level. And she looked at Roy Calloway with her gray eyes and she gave him nothing, no anger, no fear, no invitation. Just the fact of her standing where she'd chosen to stand. He looked at his men. The deputy was looking at the ground. The other 3 were ordinary men who'd been paid to make a show, and the show was becoming complicated. "This isn't finished," Roy said. "When she decides it is," I said. He held on me for a long moment with his eyes. Then he pulled his horse around, and the deputy and the other men followed, and they went back down the south trail. I stood and watched the trail until I couldn't hear the horses anymore. Ira stood beside me and watched too. When I was sure they were gone, I said, "You should eat something." She let out a long breath. "Yes," she said, "I should." We went and sat by the fire, and she heated up the leftover beans, and we ate without talking for a while, and the quiet between us was different than it had been before. It had a different weight to it, like something had settled into it that hadn't been there before. I need to tell you about the months after, because that's where the real story is. Not the confrontations, those are the outside of it. The inside of it was something slower and harder to see when you were in it. I didn't stop going to work the claim every day. I was a prospector. I worked the claim. That was what I had and what I was. Iris didn't try to change that. She understood, I think, that a man who stops doing his work loses something that doesn't come back easily, and she let me do my work. What changed was the camp. She had a mind for how things ought to be arranged, and over those months the camp became something different. I don't mean she prettied it up, that's not the word. She made it useful. She figured out a better way to store the water so it didn't silt up. She wove a mat for the dugout floor from strips of canvas and juniper, which I would never have thought to do and which made it warmer. She planted something in the small flat behind the dugout. I don't know what she put in, I'm not a gardening man, and by summer it was growing, and some of what she cooked had things in it from that patch, and it was better. She made a thing for hanging the lantern that sent the light better into the corners. She fixed my saddle rigging, which had been worn and I'd been telling myself I'd get to. She figured out a system for the sluice box that I'd been using badly. There was a way to set the angle so the gold settled in the upper riffles instead of washing through, and she'd watched me work it for 2 weeks and then said, one evening, "What if you tried it at a shallower pitch?" I'd told her it didn't work that way. She'd said she understood, just asking. I tried it the next morning because I was curious, and she was right. I got a better yield in 3 days than I'd gotten in 2 weeks. I didn't make a big thing about that. I just adjusted the sluice. She noticed I didn't make a big thing about it. Something in her face relaxed after that in a way it hadn't been before, like she'd been waiting to see how I'd handle being wrong, and I'd handled it in a way she hadn't expected. And I was changing too, though I didn't see it as clearly as I can see it now. I started coming back from the claim earlier. I told myself it was because the light was getting short in autumn, which was true. But I also started coming back earlier in summer, and the light in summer lasted a long time. I started talking, not just about the claim and the geology and the practical things. I talked about Kentucky, about a leaner, about James in Kansas, who was now 14 years old and who I hadn't seen in 11 years. I didn't plan to talk about those things. They came out in the evenings by the fire when it was cold and the stars were out, and I'd be looking into the fire and something would rise up in me, and before I'd decided to say it, I'd said it. She listened the way she did everything completely, without performance, and when she said something back it was real, it was the thing she actually thought, and sometimes what she thought was hard to hear and she said it anyway. She said once, "You should write to him." I knew who she meant. "I don't know how to," I started. "You write," she said. "You know how. You'd start with 'Dear James.' Then you'd say something true." I looked at the fire. "He might not want to hear from me," I said. "He might not," she said. "That's separate from whether you should write." I sat with that. There was something about the way she said it, not as accusation, not as pressure, just as a distinction that needed making, that I couldn't put down. She said, "He knows you're alive. He's been knowing it for 11 years and you haven't written. What do you think that means to him?" It was the hardest thing she'd said to me, and she said it quietly, no blade in it, just the truth laid out flat. I wrote to James that winter. I sat at my folding table with the lamp and Iris's pen, and I wrote 6 pages that I then cut to 2, and I sent them to a leaner's sister's address in Kansas, and I didn't know if he'd get them or read them or write back. But I sent them. What I want you to know about Iris Calloway is this. She was not a woman who needed a man to define her. She'd had a man for 6 years, and what that had done to her was not something I was going to easily repair, and I didn't try to repair it directly because I didn't think direct repair was something a person could offer another person. What you can offer is steadiness, a place where nothing comes at them, time. She had things she was good at and she did them without apology. She had opinions she held quietly but held firm, and when she said something she meant it, and when she was wrong about a thing she said so, which was rarer in a person than you'd think. She was reading better by mid-autumn, working through the history of Rome with the dictionary, and the questions she asked about Rome were the questions of someone who was thinking about the parallels to things she knew, not just collecting information. One evening she said, "The Romans kept making the same mistake." I said, "What mistake was that?" She said, thinking that someone being powerful enough to run things meant they had the judgment to run them right. I thought about Roy Calloway. I thought she probably was too. "That's a human mistake," I said, "not just a Roman one." "I know," she said, "that's what makes it interesting." She was not sunny. She had a gravity to her that didn't lift entirely, maybe never would. There were mornings when she'd sit by the fire before dawn and just look at the hills, and I'd come out and see her there and get the coffee started and not say anything, and she didn't need me to say anything. After a while, she'd come back to herself and start the day. I never asked what she thought about in those mornings. It wasn't my place to ask. A person is allowed their private ground. What I can tell you is that as the autumn went into winter, the thing that had been underneath her face, the tiredness, was changing. Not gone, but different. Like it was becoming part of the landscape rather than the whole of it. Like she was building something on top of it, slow and steady, the way a real structure is built. And I want to be honest that the thing happening to me during those months was not entirely simple either. I was 52 years old. I'd been alone for 11 years. I'd gotten used to that aloneness the way you get used to a cramped position. You stop noticing it hurts because your body adapts. Having her in the camp woke things up that I'd let go quiet. And I didn't know what to do with that, and I was not the kind of man who was good at knowing what to do with it. And so mostly I did the thing I was good at, which was working my claim and being useful and not making demands. I'll tell you the moment it changed for me. The moment I understood something I'd been moving toward without knowing it. It was December, late December, and we'd had a bad week of weather, hard wind off the ridge, sleet that turned to snow and then back to sleet, the kind of cold that gets into the joints and stays. I'd been out 3 days trying to shore up the roof of the dugout and cover the picketed area for Cobb, and I'd been working in the cold long enough that my hands weren't working right anymore. And on the 3rd day, I came inside and just sat down at the table and couldn't get up. Iris saw it. She got the fire going high and she brought water and heated it, and she sat across from me, and she took my hands in hers, both of them, and held them in the warmth of her hands while the water heated, and then she put my hands in the warm water one at a time and held them there. She didn't say anything about it, she just did it. And I sat there and let her, which was harder than any physical work I'd done in a long time, and I looked at her face while she was looking at my hands in the warm water, and she had that focused look she got when she was doing something that needed doing, and I thought, I don't want this to end. Not the winter, not any of it. I didn't say that. I wasn't ready to say it and she wasn't ready to hear it, and I knew both those things. But something settled in me that night that hadn't been settled before, and I went to sleep that night differently than I had in a long time. The feeling stayed. It didn't announce itself again in any dramatic way. It was just there, the way the creek was there, every morning when I came down the slope to work. Roy Calloway came back in January. He came alone this time. That was a different kind of statement than coming with 4 men. I wasn't sure at first what kind. He came up in the late afternoon, which I'd been using to do repair work on the claim equipment, not wanting to work the creek in the deep cold. I saw him coming up the south trail, and I stood and watched him come. He tied his horse at the juniper and came to the camp. Iris was inside the dugout. I didn't know if she'd seen him come. He stood at the edge of the fire and looked at me. "Beale," he said. "Calloway," I said. He looked around the camp. It was well ordered now, the way Iris had arranged it, the wood stacked tight, the equipment organized, the lantern hung right, the mat at the dugout entrance, the small things she'd made and fixed all showing in the details. He took it in the way a man takes in a thing he wasn't expecting. "She been here since August," he said. "That's right," I said. "She's not coming back," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," I said. He looked at the dugout. He looked back at me. "She's your wife," he said. Not Roy Calloway asserting a claim this time. Something else. Something closer to him checking whether a thing was true. "In the way that matters," I said. He was quiet a while. The fire crackled. Cobb shifted. "She was always too much for me to handle," he said quietly. He didn't say it like a man complaining. He said it like a man who'd come a long way to say the true thing, and this was the true thing. I didn't say anything to that. "I'm not," he stopped. He started over. "I'm not here to take her. I know she won't come. I know you won't." He stopped again. He had the look of a man who'd ridden 2 days to say something and wasn't sure anymore what it was. "I just wanted to see. That she's," he looked around the camp again, "that she's all right." I looked at him for a long moment. "She's better than all right," I said. He nodded. He looked at the dugout once more. Then he looked at me again, and there was something in his face that I didn't expect, not warmth, not regret exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like he was seeing what he'd had and lost and was trying to square the account honestly. Not every man could do that. It didn't make him good, but it was something. "Take care of her," he said. "I intend to," I said. He untied his horse and rode back down the south trail, and I never saw Roy Calloway again. I don't know what became of him. I didn't spend much time thinking about it. I turned and went inside the dugout. Iris was sitting on the bedroll with the History of Rome open on her knees. She looked up at me. "Was it him?" she said. "Yes," I said. "What did he want?" "I think he wanted to know you were all right." She looked at the book. "He's not coming back." "No," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good," and looked back at the book. I got the coffee started and we had a quiet evening, and that was the last of Roy Calloway. I want to tell you something about the weeks after that visit that matters. Before Roy came in January, Iris had been not exactly guarded with me. That's not the right word. She'd been present and useful and clear, which was her way with everything. But there was a part of her that was still turned inward, still listening for something, still waiting for something to go wrong. I could feel it the way you can feel weather coming, not a specific sign, just a quality in the air. After he left, that changed. It wasn't sudden. It was more like a slow release, like tension going out of something over days and weeks. She started telling me things she hadn't told me before. Not the big things, those came later, but the small things. What she'd been thinking when she planted the garden. What she wanted to do with the garden space behind the dugout if we had more room. A memory of Ohio, a river she'd loved, the smell of the spring mud there. Small things that you only give to someone when you've decided to trust them with the small things. And she started touching me differently. Not, I don't mean that as it sounds. I mean she'd put a hand on my arm when she walked past. She'd lean against my shoulder when we were sitting at the fire and she was tired. Things a person does with someone they've decided is safe. Not performing affection, not bidding for something, just naturalness. The kind that comes after you've decided. I didn't make a production of noticing, but I noticed. There was an evening in late February when she fell asleep at the fire, sitting on her log, her head tipped sideways. She'd been up early to fix the roof patch where the wind had worked at it, and she'd had a long day. I was across the fire from her and she just went under, quiet and sudden. I sat there for a while and looked at her. Then I got up and I got the good blanket, the newer one I'd bought in Red Horse, and I put it around her shoulders carefully, not waking her. She stirred but didn't wake. I went back to my seat and I put another piece of wood on the fire and sat there until she woke up an hour later, stiff-necked and a little disoriented, and looked across at me. "You should have woken me," she said. "You needed the sleep," I said. She looked down at the blanket around her shoulders. She pulled it a little tighter. She didn't say anything else. That was all, but I remembered it. I think she did too. I got the coffee started and we had a quiet evening, and the next morning things were different in the small ways that matter, and that was the last of Roy Calloway. A letter came from James in March. I'd expected nothing, or I'd prepared myself for nothing, because preparing yourself for nothing is easier than the alternative. But the letter came, addressed in a young man's hand, careful letters, not a child's anymore, to Tom Beale, Red Horse Crossing, Nevada Territory, which meant Alina's sister had forwarded it from Kansas. I stood outside the Red Horse Crossing post office and held it for a minute before I opened it. It was 4 pages. His name at the bottom was James Thomas Beale, which I hadn't known, hadn't been there to know that he'd kept the Beale. He wrote that he was well. He was working on the farm with Alina's sister's husband, had been since he was old enough to be useful. He was learning to read and do sums and had opinions on both. He wrote about a dog he'd had for 6 years who died last autumn, and the way he wrote about the dog made me understand something about who he was, how he held things, how he let himself feel them. He didn't write anything bitter. That was the thing that stayed with me longest. He could have. He had every right to. He wrote about the dog and the farm and what winter was like in Kansas, and at the end he wrote, "I always wondered what you were doing out there. I'm glad you wrote." I stood outside that post office in Red Horse Crossing and held the letter, and a man going past on a horse nodded at me, and I nodded back, and it was all I could do to hold it together until I was on the road out of town. I told Iris about it that night. I read her parts of it, the part about the dog, the last line. She listened. When I finished, she said, "Write back tomorrow." "I will," I said. "Tell him about the claim," she said. "Tell him you're working something good and you're hoping it'll come in this summer." "I don't know if it will," I said. "You don't know that it won't," she said. "Tell him. Boys that age want to know that the man in their life has prospects. It matters." I looked at her. "You have a boy too?" I asked. She'd never said, and I'd never asked because I'd learned that you wait for what someone is ready to give. She was quiet a moment, then she said, "I had a girl, she died, she was 2. The fire was between us, low and steady." "I'm sorry," I said. "It was before the worst of it with Roy," she said. I think losing her changed him into something he hadn't been." She paused. "It changed me too, not the same way." I didn't say anything. "I don't think about her every day anymore," she said. "For a long time I did. Now it's more like," she looked at the fire, "like she's somewhere that I'll find my way back to, not gone. Just ahead." I understood that. I had my own version of it with Alina. We sat by the fire until it was very late, and that was a turning point too, though I couldn't have told you at the time what it was turning toward. Spring came in fast and warm that year, the way it sometimes does out there, like the land had been holding its breath through the winter and let go all at once. The creek ran high with snowmelt and loud with it, and the canyon was full of sound for 3 weeks, the water and the birds and the wind, and then settled back into its regular quietness. Cobb got frisky the way animals do in spring and made trouble on the picket line, and I spent a morning sorting that out. Iris watched from near the fire without saying anything, and when I came back she handed me a cup of coffee and said, absolutely without expression, "He seemed committed to the project." And I sat down and drank the coffee, and after a moment I started laughing, which was something I hadn't done in a while, and she watched me do it with the same expression, which made it funnier. The claim started paying better. I don't want to oversell this. I wasn't finding the mother lode, but there was a seam, a real seam, along the west bank of the creek about 200 yards up from camp, and I'd found it in February, first the fine dust turning coarser, then the flake, and then one afternoon a piece the size of my thumbnail sitting in the pan like it had been waiting. I took that piece out and looked at it a long time. Then I put it in my coat pocket and didn't say anything about it until I had a better sense of what I was dealing with. By April, I had a better sense. There was real color in that seam. Not life-changing money, not the kind of money you read about in papers, but good honest money, the kind that adds up over time, the kind that is enough. I told Iris one evening. She listened carefully while I explained what I'd found and what I thought it was. She asked good questions. She always asked good questions now. Then she was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. "Keep working it," I said. "And after," she said, "when the seam plays out, what do you want?" I looked at the fire. What did I want? I hadn't asked myself that in a long time in those terms. I'd been thinking in terms of what I needed, what was practical, what the next step was. What do you want was a different kind of question. "James is 15, I said. "He should, if the money comes in the way I think it might, I could bring him out here or go there. One or the other, set us up somewhere." "Here," she said. "Nevada's not bad," I said. "There's land. A man could do something with good land and good water." She was quiet. "Is that," I started, and I didn't finish it because I wasn't sure what I was asking. She looked at me. The gray eyes were steady. "Are you asking if I'm going to stay?" she said. I hadn't meant to be, or I didn't know. "I suppose I am," I said. She was quiet for a moment. The fire was between us, low. "Tom," she said, "you found me in a trunk. You didn't ask any questions. You gave me your shelter and your food, and you stood between me and Roy when you had no reason to. You let me be." She paused. "I wasn't planning to go anywhere." I looked at the fire. "All right," I said. "All right," she said. Neither of us said more than that. We were not the kind of people who made speeches to each other, but something had been said, and we both knew what it was. There's a particular morning I want to tell you about. This was in May, a week or so after that conversation. I was coming up from the creek in the early morning, just after the sun got over the ridge, which was my favorite time of day out there. The light comes in low and gold, and it hits the canyon walls and turns everything a color that you don't have a word for, something between honey and rust. I'd been in the water since before dawn, and I was cold and my back was sore, and I had about a half-ounce of color in the cloth, and I was satisfied with that. I came up the slope to camp, and Iris was at the fire with a pot going, coffee already, and she turned when she heard me coming and looked at me, and the morning light was on her face, and she had one of those moments, her hair loose, the shawl she liked to wear in the mornings, a streak of flour on her forearm from whatever she'd been making, where a person looks exactly like themselves, exactly like who they are and not performing anything, and it went into me like something solid. She said, "Coffee's ready." I said, "Good." I walked up to the fire and she handed me the cup, and she looked at my hands coming up from the creek, and without saying anything she went into the dugout and came back with a cloth, and she handed it to me. I dried my hands. She was looking at the fire, adding a piece of wood. "Good morning," she asked, meaning the claim. "Good morning," I said, meaning yes and something else. She looked up at me briefly, with a slight lift in the corners of her eyes that was her version of a smile. Then she went back to the pot. And I stood there in the morning light with my coffee cup and my sore back and my half-ounce of color and the sound of the creek below us and the smell of the food she was cooking, and I thought, this is it. Not the gold, not the seam, not the plan to bring James out or buy land or any of the practical business of the life I was building. This specific morning, her at the fire and me with the cup and the light on the canyon walls. This was the thing I hadn't known I was working toward for 20 years. 20 years of alone, of Aline's memory and James far away and claim after claim and camp after camp in silence. And it had all been moving toward this canyon, this morning, this woman. I didn't say that. I drank my coffee. But I knew it, and knowing it was enough. The summer was the best summer I had on that claim. The seam kept paying, steady and honest. Not every day. There were stretches where I'd come up from the creek with almost nothing, and I'd learned long ago not to panic at a quiet week, that a claim breathed in and out and you had to breathe with it. But the weeks evened out well, and by July I had a tin on the shelf in the dugout that had real weight to it. Iris's garden behind the dugout was producing. I'm still not sure what all she'd planted. I recognized the beans and the squash, but there were other things. Herbs. Something she called greens that she used to flavor everything, and that I'd grown to depend on without noticing when it had happened. She'd traded cuttings with a woman in Red Horse Crossing who had a kitchen garden, and the two of them had a running exchange of seeds and cuttings and what worked in this soil, and what didn't, that I heard about in pieces over the summer. The woman in Red Horse was named Me, and she was the wife of Pettifer at the dry goods store, and she came to the claim once in July with her husband on a supply run, and spent an hour with Iris at the garden while I talked to Pettifer about equipment. I watched them from across the camp, Iris and this woman standing in the garden patch, both crouching to look at something Iris was showing her, talking in the easy particular way of people who have found they have a language in common. Iris laughed once, which was a thing I didn't see often, a real laugh, quick and surprised sounding. I noticed it. I stored it away. After the Pettifers left, I said, "Good people." Iris said, "Me knows things." She meant about growing, but I thought she also meant something broader. "You should go into Red Horse more," I said, "when I go." She looked at me. "I'm fine here." "I didn't say you weren't," I said. "I said you should go, get out of the canyon, see people." She looked at me for a moment with that measuring look. "You think I need managing," she said. "I think you've been hiding long enough," I said, "and you know it." She was quiet, then she said, "All right, I'll go with you next time." She did. She and Me Pettifer had their own conversation while I did my business with Pettifer, and Iris came back to the wagon with a look on her face that was not quite happiness, but was moving in that direction. She had some dried flowers Me had given her, which she hung in the dugout, and which were still there when we left the claim for good 3 years later. James came out in July. He'd been 15 when I wrote the first letter. He was 16 now, tall the way Eleanor had been tall, with her dark eyes and a jaw that was mine according to Eleanor's sister, who sent a note with him when he got on the stage in Wichita. He came alone, the whole way, which told me something about him that I'd wanted to know. He came with one bag and a calm about him that suggested he decided something before he got on the stage, and the deciding had settled him. I met him in Red Horse Crossing. He stepped off the stage and he was looking for me, and when he found me he stopped and looked at me for a long moment, and I looked at him. "You're taller than I thought," I said. "You're older," he said. It wasn't unkind, just accurate. "I am," I said. We stood there looking at each other. 15 years since I'd last seen him, and he'd been 3 years old then, and neither of us had any memory of that, which was a strange thing to stand in. Then he put out his hand, his right hand, a formal handshake, and I took it, and we shook hands, and then, this was his doing, not mine. I want to be straight about that. He held on for a moment past the handshake, his hand in mine, and I held on too, and then we both let go. "Come on," I said, "there's someone I want you to meet." He met Iris at the camp. She'd made a real effort. The camp was as good as it had ever been, food that was significantly above my usual standard, the space made welcoming in the ways she knew how to make it. She shook his hand and looked at him directly the way she looked at people, and after about 30 seconds I could see that he'd decided she was all right. She fed him and he ate the way a growing boy eats, which is to say without pause, and she approved of that. She asked him careful questions about Kansas, about the farm, about the dog he'd written to me about. He answered them fully, which he didn't do with everyone. I'd seen that already in Red Horse Crossing, where he'd been civil to the livery man and the store owner but not open. With Iris he was open. That told me something. That night, the three of us around the fire, he asked me to tell him about the claim. So I did. I explained the geology, the western seam, how a man reads a stream for color, what the signs are, what the work is. He asked questions that were good questions for someone who'd never done it. He had his mother's mind for patterns. He asked about the sluice angle, and I told him what we'd worked out, what Iris had figured out, which I said plainly. And he looked at her and she said it hadn't been complicated. She just watched how the water moved, and he said he wanted to see it the next day, and I said all right. He came down to the creek the next morning and watched me work for 2 hours. He didn't try to help, which showed judgment. You don't wade into a man's working creek and start moving things without being asked. He watched. He asked a few questions at natural breaks. He had good eyes. By the end of the morning, he understood what I was doing well enough to explain it back to me, which is the test. When the fire was low that second night, Iris said good night and went inside, and James and I sat by the fire alone. He looked at me. "Is she going to stay?" he said, "with you?" "I think so," I said. He nodded. He looked at the fire. He was thinking through something. "What happened to her?" he asked, not prurient curiosity, real wanting to understand. "She needed a safe place," I said. "I had one." He thought about that. "Are you going to marry her?" I looked at the fire. "If she'll have me," I said, "when she's ready." He nodded again. He was quiet a while. The fire settled. "She's kind," he said, "in a real way. Not just polite." "She is," I said. "Mama was kind like that," he said. I said yes. He looked at the fire a long time. Then he said, "I was angry at you." "I know," I said. "I'm not going to pretend I wasn't," he said. "Don't," I said. "You'd be right not to." "I'm not angry anymore," he said. "I don't want to be. I thought about it a long time and I decided I didn't want to carry it." I looked at him, this boy who was my son, a leaner's eyes and some particular set of the mouth that was nobody's but his own, 16 years old, and already choosing what kind of man he was going to be. "That's," I said, and I had to stop and I looked at the fire. "That took something," I said. "Yeah," he said, then. "It was your letter partly. You didn't make excuses. You said you were gone too long and you didn't make it pretty." He paused. "I'd been waiting for you to make excuses. When you didn't, I didn't know what to do with being angry anymore." I sat with that. "I should have written sooner," I said. "I should have come back sooner. Those are things I can't fix." "No," he said. "I can be here now," I said. "I know," he said. We sat by the fire until it went out, and we talked about some things and were quiet about others, and it was the most I'd talked in a single evening, and I couldn't tell you how long. He stayed for a month. He worked the claim with me for 3 weeks. I taught him to pan, to read the water, to work the sluice. He was good at it, the way a person is good at a thing when they have the patience for it, which not everyone does. He spent time with Iris in the evenings, and they talked about Rome. She'd finished the history and had opinions, and about Kansas, and about what he wanted to do with his life, which he had some ideas about but was holding them loosely, the right way at 16. When he left, he shook my hand again, and this time he held on for longer than a handshake, and when we let go he looked at me directly and said, "I'll write," and I said, "I know you will," because I did know it by then. And then he got on the stage and I stood in the dust outside Red Horse Crossing and watched until the stage was around the bend. I rode back to the claim slowly. Iris was at the fire when I got back. She looked at me and read whatever was in my face. "You all right?" she said. "Better than I've been in a long time," I said. She nodded. She handed me a cup of coffee. I took it and I stood by the fire, and the canyon was quiet around us, and I was all right. I was more than all right. We were married in September, Iris and I, in Red Horse Crossing, which wasn't much of a place to get married, but it had a preacher and that was enough. James had gone back to Kansas by then, but he'd written a letter to arrive by September, and it did 4 pages. his long, careful writing, and I read it the morning of and put it in my coat pocket. Me and Pettifer were there. The preacher's wife was the witness, a woman named Audra Fells who smelled like lavender and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Iris wore a dress she'd made herself over the summer, dark green, simple, good. She looked like herself, which is the best thing a person can look like at a wedding. Before the ceremony, outside the church, while the preacher was inside getting things ready, she stood next to me and looked at the mountains north of town. "Last chance," she said. "For what?" I said. "To change your mind," she said. I looked at her. "I'm not changing my mind," I said. She looked at the mountains. "You know I'm not easy," she said. "I know that," I said. "I've been sharing a camp with you for a year." The corner of her mouth moved. "That's true." I started. "Don't say I'm worth it," she said. "I hate that kind of thing." "I was going to say you're the most useful person I've ever shared a camp with," I said. She looked at me with an expression that I had learned over the past year meant she found something both ridiculous and correct. "That's the best you've got," she said. "I could say other things," I said, "if you wanted." She looked at me for a moment, the gray eyes, the particular steadiness of her. "Not now," she said, "later when it's quiet." We went inside and got married, and Pettifer shook my hand afterward with real feeling, and me embraced Iris, and Audra Fells gave us both a look of approval that I thought was meant to be reserved until she decided if the thing was going to take. Later when it was quiet, I told her. We were back at the claim. The Pettifers had given us a bottle of something that was better than anything usually available in Red Horse Crossing, and we'd had 2 cups each between us by the fire, and James's letter was still in my coat pocket, and the stars were out over the canyon, and the creek was running below. She was sitting beside me, both of us looking at the fire. Her shoulder was against my arm. I said, "You gave me something back." She was quiet. I said, "I'd given up on certain things, not in a dramatic way, just quietly, the way you stop expecting a season to come." I looked at the fire. "You didn't set out to give me anything. You were just yourself, and that was enough." She was quiet for a while. The fire crackled. "You gave me ground to stand on," she said finally. "I'd been moving for so long I didn't know how to stop. You had a place and you made it mine too. She stopped. Without making it a transaction." I looked at her. She was looking at the fire. "I should say," she started. "You don't have to say anything," I said. "I know," she said. "I want to." She was quiet a moment. "I chose to stay. Every day since August I've chosen it. Not because I owed you, because—" She stopped. "Because you're the steadiest thing I've ever stood next to, and I needed steady." She turned and looked at me. Her eyes in the firelight were not gray now, but something warmer. "You're a good man, Tom Beale," she said. "I know you don't think so always. But you are." I put my arm around her and she leaned into my side, and we sat like that while the fire burned down, and the creek ran below us, and the stars moved slowly across the canyon, and the mountains were out to the north, and it was quiet. That was enough. It was more than enough. The second winter on the claim, our first full winter together, was harder than the first. Not between us. Between us it was easier. We'd settled into a shape that worked, and the cold didn't change it. It just compressed it. More time indoors, more evenings around the lamp, more conversations that started about one thing and ended somewhere else. That part was not hard. What was hard was the work. The seam I'd found in February was real, I knew that, but it sat under 2 feet of frozen ground for 4 months, and there was nothing to do about that except wait, and waiting is the thing a prospector does worst. I tried to pan the lower stretches of the creek where the water ran too fast to freeze solid, and I got color some days and nothing other days, and the days of nothing in the dead of winter, when the canyon was gray and silent, and the cold had a character to it like something personally intended, Those days were hard. I'd wake at 4 in the morning with my chest tight. Not illness, I knew the difference. The other thing, the weight that came from asking yourself at 52 in the dark, what if this doesn't come in? What if I've been fooling myself? What if the seam is thin and plays out before I've saved enough to do anything real? I'd been asking myself versions of those questions for 20 years. I was good at not being destroyed by them, but they were louder that winter because now they weren't just about me. Iris knew. She didn't know the specifics, but she knew the thing underneath, the way she knew most things, by watching and being still and letting it show itself. She didn't try to talk me out of it, which would have been the wrong approach. What she did was this. She'd wake when I woke, and she'd get the fire going and put the water on. And by the time I was dressed and at the table, there'd be something hot, and the lamp would be lit, and she'd be sitting across from me with her book or the dictionary, just present, not performing anything, just there. I don't know if she knew how much that mattered. I didn't tell her at the time. I'm telling you now. There was a day in early February when I nearly quit. I don't say this often because it embarrasses me, or it used to. Now I think it's worth saying plainly. I was 52 years old and I had been working creek beds for 20 years, and I was tired in a way that went past the body. The kind of tired that asks questions. The kind that says, "What are you doing exactly? What has all of this been for? You had a wife and you buried her. You had a son and you left him. You have a claim in a canyon and you've been here 4 years, and what you have? A tin on a shelf and a woman who was better off before she needed you." That last thought was the one I was most ashamed of. Because it was unfair to Iris, and I knew it was unfair. And it came from the place in me that had been alone so long it had started to think of itself as the natural condition of a man. And anything that interrupted it was temporary and would eventually leave. And so the smart money was on the aloneness, not the rest. I was wrong. I knew I was wrong. But knowing it and feeling it are different countries. One morning in January, a particularly bad morning, I came back from the lower stretch with almost nothing in the pan and a back that felt like it was filing a formal complaint, and I sat down at the table and put my head in my hands, just for a minute, just to be honest about it. Iris was at the fire. She came over and stood behind me and put both hands on my shoulders, not moving, just resting there. "It's going to come in," she said. "You don't know that," I said. "No," she said, "but I know you, and you found it, it's there." She paused. "And even if it doesn't come the way you want it to, we'll figure out the next thing." She'd said we'll. She hadn't said it as a speech or as a comfort. She'd said it the way you say a word you've been using for a long time, and it doesn't even register as significant. I lifted my head out of my hands and looked at the wall. "All right," I said. She took her hands off my shoulders and went back to the fire. I went back out in the afternoon and panned until dark. Got nothing that day either. But the day after, the first really clear day after 2 weeks of overcast, the water running clean and cold in the winter sun, I pulled up a pan that had more color in it than any single pan I'd worked that month. Not a fortune, but enough. I stood in the creek in the cold and looked at it. "All right," I said, to the pan and the creek and nothing in particular. And that was the winter. Spring of the second year brought a thing I hadn't expected. Other people started knowing we were there. Not in a threatening way. More the way a place becomes part of the landscape of a community. Pettifer and me, of course, those were established. But Pettifer talked, the way men in stores talk, and by April there were a few other people who knew there was a claim on the canyon lot 47 with a man and his wife working it. A surveyor named Good came through looking for water rights information and stopped at our camp for coffee and talked for an hour and went on his way. 2 young prospectors came up from the South Trail in May, looking for advice about the canyon geology, and I spent a morning with them going over what I knew, and Iris fed them lunch, and they went on, and I thought later that was the first time in 20 years I'd talked to another prospector about craft rather than competition. She did that. Not deliberately, she didn't engineer it, she just made the camp a place that it was possible to stop at. That sounds small. It wasn't. A woman from a claim 8 miles north, a widow named Cordelia Satch who ran her late husband's operation alone, and was doing it well from what I heard, came to see Iris in June. I don't know exactly how they'd come to know of each other, me Pettifer, probably, who knew everyone. But Cordelia arrived on a steady gray mare, and she and Iris sat at the camp for 3 hours while I worked the creek, and when I came up for the midday meal they were still talking, and Cordelia looked at me and said, "Your wife's got sense," which was such a complete sentence that I didn't feel the need to add anything to it. Cordelia came back monthly after that. She and Iris had a friendship that I think was important to Iris in ways I couldn't provide, another woman who knew what it was to manage something hard and do it alone, who had her own ground and knew how she'd come to it. I stayed out of it mostly. It wasn't my business and didn't need to be. What I noticed was that Iris, after Cordelia's visits, had a quality about her that was different from the rest of the time. Harder to describe. Something more settled, maybe, or more outward-facing, like she'd been reminded that her world was wider than the canyon. That seemed like a good thing. The summer of the second year was when the seam gave its best. I was down at the Western Bank 3 weeks running pulling real weight, and by the end of August I had more in the tin on the shelf than I'd had at any point since Kentucky, and I sat at the folding table one evening and did the arithmetic and said, out loud to no one, "We can buy land." Iris was at the fire. She turned around. "How much land?" she said. "Enough," I said. 40-50 acres south of Red Horse. There's a parcel I've seen, good grass, spring-fed." She turned back to the fire. She was quiet for a moment. "What would you do with it?" she said. "What do you mean?" "Would you keep prospecting, or work the land?" I thought about it. "Both," I said, "for a while until the seam plays out, then the land." She was quiet again. She added a piece of wood. "I could do something with 50 acres, she said. I smiled at the inside of my coffee cup. "I know," I said. She turned around again. She was looking at me with an expression I had come to recognize as the one she wore when she was deciding whether to say the real thing. "Tom," she said. "Yes. You know I can run a farm." "I do know that." "I'm not saying it as a condition," she said. "I'm saying it so you know the picture I have, in my head, of what it could be." "What's the picture?" I said. She sat down across from me. She put her hands flat on the table, and she told me, not in a big speech, in the way she did everything practical and clear and detail by detail, what the garden could be with real acreage, what kind of stock she thought made sense for that part of the territory, how you'd orient the buildings for the wind, what you'd plant in the first year and what you'd wait on. She'd clearly been thinking about this for a while, maybe since the spring. She'd been building it in her head, while I was building it in the tin on the shelf. I listened. When she was done I said, "That's a good plan." She nodded. "I'd add horses," I said. "There's a market for good horses south of here." She considered that. "You know horses," she said. "Cobb has opinions about horses," I said. "I've been learning from him." She looked at Cobb on his picket line. "Cobb has opinions about everything," she said. "That's fair," I said. We sat there for another hour building the thing together, the farm that wasn't yet a farm, the life that was still just arithmetic and plans. And it was, I want you to know, one of the best hours I'd spent in many years. Not because of what we were planning, though the plan was good. Because of the we. The third year the seam thinned and then stopped. I'd expected it. You learn to feel a seam's intentions, the same way you learn to read the water. In March I could feel it going quiet, not dramatically, just the pans getting lighter, the color less consistent. By June it was playing out. In August I panned 3 days running and came up with almost nothing, and I stood in the creek on the third day and looked at the bank and said goodbye to it. which is a thing you do when you've worked a place long enough. I came up to camp and told Iris. She said, "Then it's time." "Yes," I said. She said, "How soon can we see the parcel?" "I'll write to the land agent tomorrow," I said. She nodded. She went back to whatever she was doing. She didn't make a thing of it. It was just the next step and she was ready. We bought the parcel in October, 42 acres with a good spring and an existing structure. Not much. A one-room building that had been some kind of storage shelter, but it was sound wood and a roof, and we moved to it before the first snow. I made 3 trips down the canyon with Cobb, and Cordelia Satch came with her wagon for the heavier things, and by the second week of October, we were off the claim and on the land. The claim was quiet when we left it. The dugout, the stone fire ring, the juniper at the north corner. I stood there one last time on the morning we left and I looked at it, and I looked at the spot where the trunk had been. You could still see a faint outline in the dirt near the base of the juniper, where the leather had rested for weeks before she'd finally moved it inside. I thought that's where it started. Then I got on Cobb and we went south. The first winter on the 40 acres was the building winter. I won't tell you it was easy because it wasn't. Building a real house out of new-cut timber in a Nevada winter requires a kind of stubbornness that I had to find reserves of, and I found them, but barely. James came from Reno for 3 weeks in December and worked with me, and between the two of us and a neighbor named Arlo Birch from 4 miles east who traded labor for help with his own fence line, we got the main rooms up before the worst of the cold. Iris cooked for whoever was working and she helped where she could, and she managed the supplies and kept everything moving, and when I was too tired to think she thought for me. She is the most competent person in any situation I have ever been in, and I knew this by then, but the building winter confirmed it in ways I didn't know were still possible. James said, one evening when Iris had gone inside and we were finishing a last cut of timber in the last of the light, "She doesn't stop." "No," I said. "How does she know how to do all of it?" he said. "The cooking and the house stuff and she knew exactly how to shore up that corner when neither of us could figure it." "She pays attention," I said, "to everything. She always has." He thought about that. "She must have had to," he said. He was right. That was where it had come from, at least in part, years of needing to know everything about your situation because if you didn't you were in danger. The knowledge had stayed. The danger was gone. What was left was a woman who could walk into any problem and figure out the approach. I was grateful for it every day. I was grateful for her every day. Spring on the 40 acres was what the picture in Iris's head had looked like, or close to it. The garden she put in that first spring was the first real garden either of us had had in years, real ground, real space, real sun. She'd been planning it through the winter, and she planted it over 3 weeks in April with the focused concentration of someone executing a plan they've thought through completely. I stayed out of the way except when asked. By June things were coming up. By July the garden was producing. By August it was the best kitchen garden in that part of the territory, though I may be a partial witness on that point. The horses I bought that spring, 2 good mares from a ranch south of us, bred well, turned out to be a sound decision. By the second year I had 3 foals and a reputation for good stock that brought buyers to our gate twice a month. I was not a horse breeder by training, but I was a man who paid attention and who asked questions of people who knew more than I did, and between those 2 things you can learn most trades if you're patient. Iris ran the household and the garden and kept the accounts, which she was better at than me, and managed the relationships with the neighbors and with me Pettifer and with Cordelia Satch who came for a month in the summer and helped with the harvest and left us better stocked than we'd been. She built a life, not just kept one. There's a difference and she knew it. We had Red Horse Crossing close enough for what we needed and far enough for privacy, which is the right distance from a town. The land knew us after 2 years. That sounds like a strange thing to say. I mean that we knew it every fence line, every wet spot in spring, Every place the grass was better and where it was thin, the way the wind came off the mountains and which way it came in different seasons. When you know a place that way it knows you back, at least that's how it feels. I worked that claim for 3 more years after that. The seam played out, as seams do, in the summer of the 3rd year, played out honest, giving what it had and then stopping. By then I had enough to buy 40 acres south of Red Horse Crossing where there was good grass and a year-round spring, and I got out of the creek and into the land business, which I was better at than I'd expected. James worked with me for 2 of those years before he went to Reno and got into a trade of his own. He had a head for numbers, my boy, and a man in Reno taught him surveying, which is a thing Nevada territory needs and will need more of. He comes back twice a year and stays a month each time. He and Iris get on in a way that pleases me more than I can say. She treats him like a grown man, which he is, and he treats her with a respect that goes past politeness into something genuine. I watch them sometimes at the table when I'm bringing wood in or coming from the barn, the 2 of them talking. He asks her things he doesn't ask me, not because there's anything between him and me that's still wrong, we're past that, but because she's a different kind of mind than I am, and he knows it. She'll say something that makes him go quiet for a moment, working it through, and then he'll say something back that she has to think about. And I'll come in and set the wood down and they'll pull me into it, and we'll sit there for an hour going at some question the way you go at a good meal, not hurrying it. Those evenings are among the best of my life. I say that knowing what my life has held. He told me once, the 2 of us riding fence on the north side of the property where the grass goes thin in August, that he was glad I'd written, that it had mattered. He didn't dress it up. He just said it, looking at the fence line like he'd been carrying it for a while and decided to set it down. I said it mattered to me too, more than I knew how to say at the time. He nodded. We rode on. Neither of us brought it up again, which is the right way to do it. Iris planted the 40 acres with the confidence of someone who knows what she's doing, which she turned out to. She has opinions about soil and water, and what goes where that have proved correct more times than not, and I've learned to ask before I do anything with the land that isn't obvious. There's a garden behind the house that is the best garden in that part of the valley, and people know it. She doesn't make a point of it. She found her daughter's record too, in a roundabout way. The girl had been buried in Mineral Fork and there was a registry. Cordelia Satch found it through a contact she had there, years after we'd left the canyon. She brought Iris the registry entry one afternoon when I was out in the north pasture, and when I came back in the evening, Iris was sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of her, not reading it, just her hands flat on either side of it. I went and got the coffee going. I didn't say anything. After a while I set a cup in front of her and sat down across. She said, "Cordelia found the record." I said, "Yes." She looked at the paper. "Clara May Calloway," she said, 2 years old. I said, "Yes." She picked up the paper and folded it carefully along its creases and put it in the Bible. Then she picked up the coffee and held it in both hands. "I'm glad to have it," she said. "Good," I said. That was all that needed to be said. She kept it in the Bible. I've never asked what she does with it in her private time. That's her ground, and a person's grief belongs to them. Me Pettifer comes out to the place twice a month when the weather is good, and she and Iris will spend an afternoon at the garden or at the table with coffee, and I will make myself useful elsewhere, which I am good at doing. The Pettifers have become the kind of people you don't know how you lived without. That happens, sometimes, in a place as spare as this. You find 1 or 2 good people, and they become the whole of your community, and it's enough. Cordelia Satch sold her canyon claim 2 years ago and bought land of her own 7 miles east of us, and she and Iris see each other monthly. They are the best kind of friends, the kind who don't need anything from each other except the talking and the company, who part with nothing unfinished between them. I am glad Iris has her. There are things a woman needs to say to another woman that she can't say to me, not because I wouldn't understand, but because the understanding isn't the point. I keep writing to James. He keeps writing back. His letters have changed over the years, gotten longer, fuller, more himself in them. He writes about the surveying work, about the country he sees doing it, about a young woman in Reno that he mentioned once and then didn't mention again for 6 months and then mentioned again, which tells me something. I don't push. He'll tell me when he's ready. When he comes to visit, he helps with whatever's in front of us, fence or building or stock, and in the evenings he and Iris talk and I listen, and some nights I think, Alina would have liked him. She would have liked both of them. She would have liked this. I keep writing to James. He keeps writing back. His letters have changed over the years, gotten longer, fuller, more himself in them. He writes about the surveying work, about the country he sees doing it, about a young woman in Reno that he mentioned once and then didn't mention again for 6 months and then mentioned again, which tells me something. I don't push. He'll tell me when he's ready. What I can tell you is that there are evenings in spring, when the light is long and the 40 acres is green and the grass moves in the wind and the mountains are out to the north. When I look at what we've built, the house, the garden, the fences, James's letters stacked on the shelf, the 2 horses in the small pasture, the smoke from the supper fire, and I am still surprised. Not by the gold. I never found the life-changing kind. Never did. I found enough, and enough turned out to be everything I needed to build the actual thing. I'm surprised that I'm here. That a man who spent 11 years alone in the cold learning to want less and less ended up with this. This particular life, this particular woman, this particular evening. I think sometimes about what a different kind of man would have done that August evening in '69 when he opened a trunk and found a woman inside. There are men who would have closed it again and walked away, not wanting the trouble. There are men who would have made it into a thing she owed them, who would have kept a ledger. There are men who would have tried to own what they'd helped, which is a worse thing than the ledger. I didn't do those things, not because I was particularly good, because I was tired and old enough that the calculation of what I was going to get out of it wasn't the first thing I thought of. I thought, she needs water. I got water. That's all it was, and that turned into everything. What I did was simple. I found a woman who needed a place to rest. I gave her one. I didn't ask for anything in return, and I didn't make a show of what I gave, and I let her be what she was without trying to shape it into something more useful to me. And she, being the person she is, clear-eyed and steady and braver than anyone I've known, she chose to stay. Freely, clearly, every day. A man my age knows what that's worth. Not every man gets it, I know that. The valley has accepted us by now, which takes time and a certain kind of steadiness to earn. The neighbors know us, not just to nod at, but the way people know each other in a place where everyone sees everyone's trouble and no one pretends otherwise. There's a man named Harker 2 miles west who helped me dig a drainage trench last wet spring without me asking, and I've helped him mend fence twice, and that's the whole of the relationship, and it's solid. There's a family named Quintana at the south end of the valley who have been there since before Nevada was a territory, and who know the land here better than anyone. And Iris has learned more from Mrs. Quintana about what this soil will and won't do than from any book or catalog. And Mrs. Quintana has started calling her by her first name, which I understand from Harker means something in that family. People respected her before they respected me, if I'm being honest. She came to it first. She went to the women of the valley, and she learned their names and the names of their children, and she went to meetings when there were meetings and brought things when something needed bringing, and she was useful and present and real, and the valley knew a real person when it saw one. My reputation came largely through being her husband, which I am entirely fine with. I stand on the porch of the house we built, and I look at the 40 acres going green in the evening light. The spring is running. The mares are moving along the south fence. The garden behind the house is full and organized, and more productive than either of us expected, which is what happens when a person with Iris's kind of mind and that kind of stubbornness has real ground to work. This is what I didn't have for 20 years. This is what I'd stopped letting myself want. It started with a trunk at the edge of a claim. A man my age knows what that's worth. Not every man gets it, I know that. Iris is at the door behind me. I can hear her inside finishing up supper, the particular sound of the Dutch oven on the stove, the one we've had since the claim. It came through 3 moves and 2 hard winters, and it still works right. Some things do. She'll come to the door in a minute and call me in. She won't say anything elaborate. She'll say something like it's ready or come in before it gets cold, and I'll go in and we'll eat and it'll be good. It's always good now. She's standing in the lamp light when she opens the door, and the light is behind her, and she looks at me the way she looks at me sometimes. Not like I'm something to manage or something to worry about, but like I'm the thing she was going to and she's arrived. It lasts maybe a second. Then she says, "Tom, it's ready." The light is going off the mountains to the north. The horses are quiet in the pasture. The valley is settling into the dark. I go in.